They are hitting our schools, our hospitals, our homes. They are on purpose destroying critical infrastructure, taking away our water to drink and the gas that keeps us from freezing at night. Nothing is safe anymore, not even school buses or kindergartens. And who will be held accountable? Who? This is a voice telling the story of severe human rights violations currently taking place in Ukraine, portraying how the right to life, the right to the freedom of movement, the right to education, the right to health, the right to a reasonable standard of living, and many other basic human rights within a few weeks can be taken away in a war without reason. While most voices right now are calling for immediate cease of the war, others already are also focusing on how will we be able to secure accountability for these atrocities in the future. To be able to find durable solutions to conflicts, human rights must be respected, protected, and fulfilled. To be able to safeguard human rights, peace and security are key elements. Still, in spite of this, looking at language, research, theory, and practice, sometimes it looks like human rights and peace and security are two separate fields with little interconnection. Sometimes it even feels like there is an enormous gap in between them rather than them being integrated parts of the same agenda for a more sustainable world. This seminar and the Swedish Foundation for Human Rights launched today of the report, The Role of Regional Human Rights Institutions and the Quest for Peace in Europe, with a comment on the invasion of Ukraine, is one small step to try to close this gap. My name is Hanna Gördes. I'm a Swedish human rights lawyer and the founder of Hanna and Goliath Law and Education. And today I have been given the privilege and the task to moderate and facilitate this important seminar that is arranged by the Swedish Foundation for Human Rights. And I would like to start off by giving you some practical information on this webinar. The webinar will be held in English with subtitles. So in order to activate the subtitles, you will need to press CC down in the Zoom menu and choose Show Subtitles. Since the webinar is held in a webinar function, it means that all of you who are attending, your camera and your microphone is automatically closed down for all attendees. However, we would really like to encourage you to post questions and post comments, and you can do that in the chat, and we will all be able to then see this. And we will try also to catch as many of your questions and comments as possible. I also would like to mention that this webinar is now being recorded and that the report that is launched today, it can be found later on at the Swedish Foundation for Human Rights website, and you find that on www.humanrights.se, and this the address for that will also be posted soon in the chat if it's not already there. I would like to start off before I invite many of our distinguished guests that are here with us today to listen a bit and hear a couple of words about the report that is actually being launched here today as well. And that is the reason that we're having this seminar. And for that, I would like to actually invite the authors of the report. So could I please ask Fredrik Svensson and Frida Lochner to join me? Hi, Frida. Hi, Fredrik. Very nice to see you. I would like to start off by asking a question to you. Could you tell me a little bit more about the findings in your report? I know you've been putting a lot of work on this report, so would you like to share some of the findings?
Well, thank you, Hanna. First of all, this report on Europe is different to the previous reports as it covers 3 intergovernmental organizations, while the ones on Africa and America only included 1 each. And this made it more complex, and we didn't arrive at the same detailed recommendations to different actors as before. However, the 3 organizations that we studied were all founded as peace projects of different kinds. And while none of the normative frameworks provides for an explicit right to peace, they are clearly conducive to an environment where the protection, promotion, and fulfillment of human rights connects to the upholding of peace and security, as well as the protection of rights and freedoms in times of armed conflict. And the normative frameworks in general also complement each other and build upon work done by their peers, avoiding duplication and reinforcing strengths. And then if we look at the example of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we can see how the different organizations act according to their mandates. In the case of the Council of Europe, Russia was excluded, while in the OSCE, at least partly due to its consensus model of decision-making, Russia remains a participating state. And now, in the end, Russia withdrew from the Council of Europe and also denounced the European Convention on Human Rights. However, Russia is still bound by its obligations concerning the many cases before the court, and also any new case that concern events until the 16th of September, when the period of transition ends. However, this situation is new to the court, and we will have to see how it handles it. But in conclusion, on the role of the human rights institutions, the conclusion must be that they do play important roles to peace and security in the region. They clearly relate to conflict prevention, early warning, and peace building, and their work connect this to the promotion, protection, and fulfillment of human rights, also to the rule of law, access to justice, and transitional justice. And they also liaise between themselves and have access to and are used as experts by the decision-making bodies of their respective organizations.
Ferg, I need to follow up on that because you mentioned a couple of things. We will be having guests here soon, both speaking about the European Court of Human Rights and its function, and as well from the OSCE. But you mentioned you studied 3 different organizations in this report. Could you just mention briefly which 3 organizations for the people listening?
Yes. So we studied the Council of Europe, and we studied the OSCE, and we studied also the European Union.
Okay. And can I ask you something? Because you also mentioned that, I mean, this report is a bit different than other reports you've written, and you mentioned the Inter-American and the Africa system. So can you just say something brief about that? Because I don't think everybody knows about the work of the Swedish Foundation. So what is that? What is the previous reports? What have you done before?
Well, so this is the third in a row of reports that are studying the same subject, so to speak, and we started out with Africa, which was presented in 2020, and then we studied the Americas, and this report was released early this year. So in those cases, we of course focused on the regional organizations of those areas, those regions. So the African Union and the Organization of American States. But in Europe, it became a bit more difficult as we felt that we needed to study all these 3 organizations.
Yeah, so more than the European Court, of course. And it's really interesting because we will be having a lot of guests today with a lot of experience working within the systems or with the systems, telling us about the nexus between human rights and peace and security. But before I let our first guest in, I have some more questions for you, because, I mean, this report focuses especially on the European system, and your previous reports have also had a regional focus. So I want to ask about that. I mean, we work, all of us, a lot with international mechanisms as well. So why is a regional focus so important when looking at human rights and peace and security? Frida, do you have any thoughts on that, or is it
I'm feeling
actually Frederick has.
Yes. Well, let me give you some examples. Well, first starting off with saying that, I mean, the regional organizations are one step closer if we compare to the UN, and they also count with their own accountability mechanisms. And one such mechanism, central one, is the European Court of Human Rights, of course. Even though the court was not designed primarily for enforcing states' obligations in relation to armed conflict, it has been instrumental in providing jurisprudence regarding rights and freedoms in conflict and post-conflict situations. And the court has, for example, contributed to the interpretation of the right to life, the prohibition of torture, the right to liberty and security, and derogations in times of conflict. Furthermore, the court has also delivered many decisions dealing with a wide range of issues relating to transitional justice and the rule of law, as well as to defining the extent of jurisdiction that states parties exercise and within which they have the obligation to secure human rights in armed conflict. So this body of jurisprudence constitutes an important contribution to defining state responsibilities in conflict and post-conflict situations. So although the court is a mechanism that grinds slowly and therefore not necessarily is the solution to an upcoming or ongoing armed conflict, it sets standards which have implications on peace and security. And let me only give a few examples in the framework of Ukraine. When cases are submitted to the court, it may specify interim measures to the parties. And already on the 28th of February, Ukraine filed an application against Russia before the court and requested the court to take interim measures. And the court acted the following day, calling on the Russian government to refrain from military attacks against civilians and civilian objects, as well as other violations of international humanitarian law. And as for a case of Ukraine versus Russia regarding Crimea, the court in its decision declared and proved that the Russian argument for its actions in Crimea, namely that it was only a helping hand for the will of the Crimean people by implementing the result of the 2014 so-called referendum, the court found it false, as Russian forces gained effective control over those territories before the so-called referendum. And proving these facts can be important for other processes, legal processes, as well as political ones. Then when it comes to the European Union, it has implemented sanctions, which can be seen as a form of enforceability mechanism. And the European Union has also activated its temporary protection directive for the first time, meaning the right to instant protection for Ukrainians fleeing the war. And finally, as for the OSCE, it had a sizable observation mission in Ukraine already since 2014, but this was discontinued in April due to a Russian veto. And within the framework of OSCE, Ukraine also supported by 45 states. Ukraine activated the Moscow mechanism on the 3rd of March, which meant an in-country investigative mission. And this mission was delivering its report on the 5th of April. And the report at this early stage contributed by lining out the pattern regarding contraventions of OSCE commitments, war crimes and crimes against humanity, and violations of international humanitarian and human rights law. And looking more generally at the OSCE, an interesting general aspect is the High Commissioner on National Minorities, which was established to strengthen OSCE early warning and conflict prevention capabilities. So this clearly connects human rights and peace and security. And these and many other examples show that the regional organizations and the human rights institutions are important players for peace and security. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just one brief, short question more, because then we need to move on. But what would you say is the main challenges for the European system in this nexus? Like in just some short sentences, what is the main challenges?
Well, one challenge which is common to the systems is that the courts can only act on the cases filed before it. So it doesn't really have any possibility to take its own initiatives. So I guess that is one big challenge. But that is a part of the system, that's speaking how it works.
Do you have any thoughts, Frida, on that?
Yes, I have, and I would try to keep it short. But one concern is the relationship between the human rights institutions and its member states. Although the organization provides for comprehensive normative frameworks and mechanisms within the context of human rights, peace, and security, it depends on the member states' political will to ratify and implement them, and furthermore to follow the decisions made by the organizations. For example, in the report, we highlight the case of the detained human rights defender, Mr. Kavala, where Turkey has refused to abide the European Court of Human Rights' decision to release him, and completely neglect the statements on violations of human rights addressed by the Council of Europe's Commissioner of Human Rights. The fact that a state party to the European Convention of Human Rights and a member state of the Council of Europe refuses to follow recommendations and legally binding decisions weaken the institution's power to fulfill their work. Another related example is the fact that member states decide to withdraw from different agreements as well as the organizations, such as Turkey and the Istanbul Convention, Russia and the Council of Europe, as well as the Convention, and the United Kingdom and the EU. So challenges such as states' lack of respect, political will, and enforcement threaten the credibility of the human rights system in Europe, and thus the ability to maintain the protection of human rights, peace, and security in the region. At the end of the day, it is the states that constitute the human rights system. And may I mention one additional concern?
Very brief, because we need
to... brief. Okay, yeah, because it's been raised by several stakeholders, which is worth to mention. And it is the improvement of the necessary but difficult coordination between the different entities involved in the investigations of international crimes currently committed in Ukraine. So we look very much forward to hearing what all the eminent experts have to say today, both concerning the system as well as the situation in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frida. And I haven't had the time to read your whole pamphlet because, it's launched today. I had a little preview, of course, but I've read some of it and it's really, really interesting. So I would really warmly recommend all of you joining us today to go into the website of the Human Rights Foundation after this webinar and download the report because it's well worth reading. Now I actually would like to introduce a representative of one of the organizations that Frida and Frederick have been studying in this nexus. I would like to introduce Andrea Huber. And Andrea is the head of the Human Rights Department at the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights at the ODIHR office. So we're so glad you're joining us, Andrea, today and can tell us a little bit more about your work. So nice having you here, and I hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and a very, very good morning to all of you. So, of course, at the OSCE, we're always happy to be the subject of studies. So thank you for covering our organization. I have been asked to give a bit of an overview of how the OSCE fits into the European human rights architecture, but also some of my observations as head of ODIHR's Human Rights Department on the challenges that we face. So maybe let me say first that the OSCE is not necessarily, I think, the best known regional human rights institution in my experience. Also, it is the largest in geographic scope. We have 57 participating states. That, of course, goes beyond the geographic region that we label as Europe. And it is maybe the most relevant one when it comes to conflict, I would say. Indeed, the OSCE started its life as CSCE, Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, and that was rooted in the Cold War as a mechanism for dialogue between the West and the Soviet Union. And it was in that forum that the idea was articulated that security and peace in Europe is inextricably linked, not only to the political and military arena, but also to human rights, and certainly to economic and even environmental matters. That was already built in. So the first set of commitments in these three dimensions were set out in the Helsinki Act of 1975. And these still are the basis of the OSCE's comprehensive security concept. And as the CSCE became a fully fledged organization, these commitments were built on, with a particularly important expansion in their democratic ambition in the early 90s, following the collapse of the Soviet Union. The OSCE is built around, I think that's important to emphasize, politically rather than legally binding commitments. We call them commitments. And it operates on a consensus principle. And that means that we need an agreement of all 57 participating states for decision, which you can, as you can imagine, is challenging sometimes. We need that when we want to add new commitments, but also for decisions such as the budget or to establish field operations. The origin of the OSCE goes back to a time when there was a fear of another global war between two superpowers with a nuclear arsenal. And in my eyes, this puts it in contrast to the Council of Europe, which I think emerged much more as a peacetime organization to address human rights in Europe, and which operates not on the politically binding commitments that I mentioned, but on a legally binding framework with a legal enforcement mechanism. Despite the very serious challenges that the consensus principle brings to the OSCE, particularly in times of conflict and democratic backsliding, it also means that while, and it has been mentioned, Russia and Belarus are not members of the Council of Europe, the OSCE is one of the few remaining forums which still brings all European countries together at the same table. We must, of course, recognize that despite our conflict prevention mandate, the OSCE has not been able to prevent conflict in its region, least of all recently, and we will talk about this more later today. But I would sustain that this is not because the security concept of linking security, democratic values, and human rights is flaws. I think it is precisely because we haven't paid enough attention to human rights and the rule of law that we find ourselves in the situation we are in today. Authoritarian rule has increased to the extent that there were and are no checks and balances preventing or stopping the military attack on Ukraine. We have seen over the past decade how the space for civil society has been shrinking in the OSCE region, and how the separation of powers has been eroded and independent institutions have been undermined, including the judiciary and the media. And in the last few years, actions against civil society and human rights organizations and defenders has become bolder and more blatant in many countries. The current war in Ukraine and measures that other states have taken in response is a reminder that the political will to tackle difficult topics too often can be found only when the gravity of situations has reached an extreme. Factors which previously might have prevented or shortened armed conflict are absent in a society where the freedoms to peacefully protest and to express dissenting voices have been steadily eroded over years. We are not short on analysis of the threats to human rights and democracy. We were not in the past decades. There are numerous reports of very prestigious organizations, probably including your own, who have pointed out that ever more countries are backsliding in their democratic commitments, and also on the recipe that is used to do so. First, erode the independence of institutions. Second, blend with media takeover. Thirdly, grind civil society. And finally, garnish with changes to the electoral system. The use of the counterterrorism narrative has also been very useful to many as a tool to go after opposition and human rights defenders. The more vague the anti-extremism laws, the better. Digital technologies, often hailed as a progress, have also exposed human rights defenders to new threats, including surveillance, malware, and cyberbullying. Nationalism, misogyny, and racism have been allowed to flourish, both offline and online. They were replacing a measured debate with divisive rhetoric. And as if we didn't struggle enough, the COVID-19 pandemic has led to an unprecedented rolling back of rights and freedoms in almost all countries, sometimes used genuinely to protect the life and health of the population, but also as a welcome opportunity and cover to restrictions of human rights. Ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, human rights work is a long-term battle and one that needs to be fought on many fronts at the same time. So while our attention is rightly on the war in Ukraine, I would also urge that we learn the lessons from the past and do not take our eyes off the tensions that are simmering elsewhere and the erosion of human rights in other places. Let me conclude with a quote from Albert Einstein, which is ever so true. The world will not be destroyed by those who do evil, but by those who watch them without doing anything. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And I have a sense that most people joining this seminar are people who, fortunately enough, don't sit by watching without doing anything, because it's quite a specialized seminar. And I think people who join this are probably very interested. And I'm so happy for you joining us and giving us an extra view on this. I would like to ask you a question. What do you think are the most biggest challenges for your organization when it comes to the nexus of human rights and peace and security today? Because I mean, you talked a little bit about, and Fredrik also, about the difference between the OSCE and, for example, the Council of Europe. But could you just a little bit elaborate on that? What are the biggest challenges for your organization?
I mean, I think first of all, it's of course the question of the consensus, which your colleagues have already mentioned, and which I mentioned in my presentation. So of course, in an organization where you always need agreement by 57 participating states, this is an issue, of course, when it comes to the inclusion of the budget, the mandates of the OSCE field operations, which run out at the end of the year, and various other issues such as the Human Dimension Implementation Meeting, which we're supposed to have every year. So that has been a challenge already in the negotiations in the past year, but it's not going to become easier. Yet, I think it's very important to flag that once the conflict will come to an end and there will be a ceasefire, hopefully soon, there will be a need for an organization to also be the monitor and to document and to make sure that both parties implement whatever ceasefire is reached in good faith. And I don't see any other organization who would be around to do that other than the OSCE. Of course, the challenge that the OSCE has otherwise are the same as other organizations. I think the societies have been have become, including myself, very complacent about the human rights that we enjoy in the democratic institutions. We forgot a little bit that we really need to fight for this every day. We cannot think, in post-war Europe, we have achieved democracy and we have achieved human rights, and so we can lean back and enjoy. That is just not the case. We need to defend it, and we need to defend it more.
And
yeah.
And from this point of view, it's interesting because, as you said, there are many other conflicts right now that we need to attend to as well. However, Ukraine has really been a wake-up call for many people, so being so close in Europe. So it's quite interesting. I want to follow up on one thing you said, because you mentioned briefly, but it was really interesting, new technologies. And you said they are often hailed, but we should also see, the impacts from a human rights lens. Could you just elaborate a little bit on that, on your thoughts?
Very happy to. It's a very important issue and one that we have started to look into more also in my department. So I think we think of technologies, and in particular digital technologies, as something very modern and progressive. And of course, it does allow us also to promote human rights, to communicate human rights to bigger audiences and bring people together. But at the same time, there are really very, very big downsides to the same technologies which are used to curtail human rights. And that includes in particular surveillance, and at the same time, the amplification of hatred through online means. So what we see in participating states often is that the communication of the human rights community or position is restricted online to clamp down on dissent. mass surveillance. I've mentioned this, and this affects really everyone because everyone leaves a massive trail of data that is being collected. We often speak here of the datafication of human behavior and digital communication that allows individuals to be surveyed, but also to be micro-profiled based on data harvesting technologies. So personal data of individuals, of you, me, of each of our participants is basically harvested like fruit on a constantly flourishing tree. And the online environment has also massive implications for democracy, in particular through the mis and disinformation campaigns and the use of profiling and manipulative micro-targeting of the electorate prior to campaigns. So this, I think, is also an issue that has by far not been raised and addressed enough. Then, of course, there is the digital divide. No, there are discrepancies in who can access digital tools and the internet, including between men and women, but also, of course, other groups are disadvantaged in accessing digital technologies, and that means that they have less opportunity to access their rights as well. And during COVID lockdowns, this was particularly pertinent. And then finally, maybe let me mention algorithms, which is very hard to understand, but we see a recurring problem wherever algorithms are used because they're based on historic data that may have an inbuilt bias. And this bias then is translated into the algorithmic system and will make whatever output the algorithm has also one that is biased. And of course, these algorithms are also what is used to amplify hate speech and controversial content online and lead to these problems in democracies. I would maybe say on this finally, and that is also one challenge that we face, how to address the right to privacy, because this is what we call a gateway right. Without privacy, you do not have access to many other rights. But we've become a bit complacent, all of us, we're using Google Maps, etc., we're using social media, we leave a host of data to harvest.
Mm. Yeah, and it's really, I mean, this has been very, very clear. I mean, just researching for facts now during the war has been also very difficult for many of us following it, not being on the ground, because it's what should you read, what should you trust? I mean, all these issues are extremely relevant. Andrea, thank you so much for joining us. Our time right now is running out, but I would like to really encourage everyone who's listening that if you have any questions for Andrea, please post them in the chat. We'll try to catch them up later also during the webinar. And thank you so much for joining us and giving us just a little brief picture of your important work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next speaker will be telling us a little bit more. She has a lot of practical experience working within the European system with the European Court of Human Rights. Our next speaker is Anna Rogalska-Hedlund. Anna is a Swedish human rights lawyer, and as I mentioned, she has an extensive background with herself actually taking cases of human rights abuses to the European Court of Human Rights. And she will also reflect a little bit about the nexus between human rights, peace, and security. And as I mentioned before, please feel free to pose questions to Anna and also to Andrea and other participants if you want in the chat. So I'll hand over to you, Anna. Nice having you with us.
Thank you so much. So I think I'm sharing my presentation now, right?
Yes, you are. We see it perfectly.
And thank you to the previous two speakers. Very interesting listening to you. So I've been fortunate. I was born in Sweden, and the cases I've worked on have rarely been of the dignity that lawyers in Russia and Ukraine have to face today, but also have had to face previously. But just adding into the discussion on new technologies and political will, I can't help but mentioning that I did take one case to court when I was working for an organization called Centrum för Rättvisa, Center for Justice, which was referring to the surveillance system in Sweden. And the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights did find a violation in the end. It took them 13 years to do so. What I find quite disturbing now is that the Swedish government is not taking much action to actually adjust the legislation according to the critique that was made in the judgment. So we have issues also in other countries, even if the situation is much more stable. But as a lawyer working with practical cases, the European Convention on Human Rights is the absolutely most powerful tool that I have. That's my weapon, so to say. Not because of the wording of the convention, because the wording is extremely vague and doesn't really say much in practice in a concrete situation. But throughout the years, the case law of the European Court of Human Rights, to which individuals have been able to complain for many years now, has given these vague rights very concrete meaning. There is a monitoring system attached to the convention system. So after a judgment is delivered by the court, there is the committee of ministers who will then guard that the judgment is implemented. This is, of course, important, but I want to highlight the evolution or the changes in the last 2 decades, really, where more and more countries, member states to the convention system have incorporated the convention into their own legal orders. Now, this is so important because this brings the document, the convention, as a legal tool for domestic lawyers. And the domestic courts also become the guardians of the convention next to the European Court of Human Rights. Now, I personally believe that this change in the system is key to making the protection of human rights effective on a larger scale. Now, I think Frida in particularly mentioned what happens if we do not have the political will to incorporate these rules and to have domestic courts and politicians live up to the standards of the convention. And I will give 2 examples. One, I will look a little bit on the situation in Russia, and then I will look at the issue of climate change. And starting with Russia, I review the case law from Strasbourg, from the European Court of Human Rights on a quarterly basis, and I've been doing that for a couple of years now. And in another for another seminar, I was reviewing my reports for the last years, and it was really striking looking back at the judgments against Russia. To what extent Russia has been found violating rights on so many levels of society. Now, I think we're all looking back, realizing that there were so many signals of this happening, and it's easy to be wise looking back, of course. I think still it's interesting to really go through the case law. And I've mentioned a few cases here. And as you see, if you only have one brown dot filtering the transparency and the functionality of a state, it is a dark filter, but you can still see through. but the more dots you get, well, you end up not being able to see through at all. And these examples I have here are by far not all violations. But we have, of course, the very serious violations already. Like Fredrik mentioned, the court found that Russia has jurisdiction over eastern Ukraine as of February 2014. So we're talking about the first Russian intervention in Ukraine. There are more than 7,000 individual cases referring to incidents relating to the first invasion or annexation and occupation of eastern Ukraine and Crimea. But we also had the war in Russia, where last year the Grand Chamber of the European Court found that the detention of civilians and prisoners of war violated a number of articles. But on a more practical level, there are a number of cases. One of them is the Cooperative Neptuni Service versus Russia, but there are more similar cases where about 30 years later, they reclassify building permits. And this was a shopping mall that was then ordered to be destroyed all of a sudden. But we have private homes that have been treated in the same way. We have forest land that has been reclassified. So we're talking about just the well-functioning of a normal society that is very problematic with these judgments. Domestic violence, where the European Court recently ordered that there must be acute legislative measures to protect women from domestic violence. There is very little legislation in place today. We have another type of cases, which the first judgment was in 2014, but there have been many similar cases with suicides within the Russian military, where there's a culture of pennilessness, and we are talking about potentially around 1,000 people every year that commit suicide in this environment. We, of course, have the horrific murders of human rights activists and the former Secret Service worker, where last year 2 judgments were delivered. In one case, the European Court of Human Rights went so far as to say that it was actually ordered by the state, the murder. We also have a number of cases that have been initiated by the opposition politician Navalny. And there are 6 judgments to this date, and there are about 10 more pending. Now, this gives a very dark picture, and together with the fact that Russia has withdrawn from the convention system and has also been excluded from the convention system, even though formally the convention is to apply. From what I hear, the Russian state is no longer responding in the procedures before the European Court of Human Rights. Which is, of course, a very...
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but our time is actually running out a little bit. So I would like to ask you, if all these judgments and court cases are really interesting, is there anywhere, because I know you've been reading and you've also been translating, if we want to read more about them lately on, you could perhaps recommend that, because we would need to move on now. Yeah.
Yeah, so let me just take the example, which I think is less depressing, just very quickly. The issue of climate change, where I do think that the European Convention will be. There are a number of cases in many countries around the world right now where various groups are requiring more action to mitigate the human impact on climate change. Now, why I mentioned this is in the relation to security and peace is that the risk that climate change entails are very similar to a war situation. We will have complete chaos in certain parts of the world. I think in those countries where the convention has shown to be the strongest tool to actually argue that states must act in this situation, basing their arguments mainly on Article 2, the right to life, and Article 8, the right to private and family life, and especially the right to health. There are now 2 cases that have been relinquished to the Grand Chamber. So we will hear more from the European Court on these matters. And I think that the states involved in this case, in these cases, are more inclined to make the system work and to actually take in the court reasoning in these cases. Yes, you had a question, Anna.
Okay, thank you. No, I would like to ask you something, because you showed all these court cases, and it's really interesting. And I know you've been following this for a long time. And what you're describing is more or less a total disregard for human rights, and from Russia in many parts. So I want to ask you something. Should this not have been like an alarm clock? I mean, what would happen now? I mean, with the invasion of Ukraine, for example, wouldn't this total disregard of human rights within the country, shouldn't we have been able to see that in some way as an alarm clock? What do you think about that?
I think, I think, like Andrea Huber said, I think many people saw it, and there have been a number of reports, and yet we weren't able to stop it from happening. Perhaps still we could learn from this lesson and see that when we have this type of multiple violation on multiple levels, we are approaching what would be some kind of collapse of a democratic and peaceful system. And the risk of severe threats to peace and security are imminent. And if we could use, for example, the case law from Strasbourg as an alarm clock, then perhaps for the future, yes, we could act earlier and stronger.
You would need to create some kind of system on that though, right? On using it as an alarm clock. Like, is that systematically done today, or what would you say?
No, I don't think that that this perspective is really taken on board. I think it's in the back of everybody's mind, but it should be in the front of people's mind. So, and unfortunately, all these fantastic systems that we have been put in place due to bad experiences. So I think we need, but I think that this is definitely a perspective that could be valuable in preventing history from repeating itself.
So thank you so much, Anna, for sharing your time with us. Now I would like to, we're going to take a short break within a little while, but before that, I would like to once again invite all of you listening to write comments or questions. And I see there has been some questions posed in the chat, and I think the question that has been posed is, how do you feel about the fact that from September 22nd this year, the citizens of the Russian Federation will lose the opportunity to apply to the European Court of Human Rights? And I think that question is posed probably both to Anna and Andrea, so please feel free to write your comments in the chat as an answer to that. I would like to now hand over briefly to Linda Borgenhed, who comes from the Folke Bernadotte Academy, and she will give us a brief comment about what we've heard so far, and also a better understanding on their own work with human rights, peace and security. And for those of you who haven't heard about the Folke Bernadotte Academy, it is the Swedish government agency for peace, security and development, and it has the overall mission to support international peace and crisis management operations. So I hand over to you, Linda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and all the previous presenters. And great thanks to the authors of the report. I've had the opportunity to look through it with great interest, and I'm very happy FBA has been able to support the process of preparing this interesting study. So yes, how does human rights, the regional human rights systems actually link with peace and security and building resilience, preventing conflict? That's an topic we're also exploring. Personally, I work on security sector reform and have elaborated on a few publications on that topic. Like Hannah mentioned, I think there's different communities, the human rights community on one hand and the peace and security practitioners, and there needs to be a greater dialogue, not only seeing the regional human rights instruments and mechanisms as normative foundations with rules and norms to be implemented in domestic systems, but also seeing them as a part of democratic management and oversight mechanisms that should also be taken into account in the democratic system of a country. So looking at Ukraine and most countries in conflict, when there's an armed conflict, we normally see an increased militarization, military administration taking over decision-making functions, which is normal and needed in many armed conflicts. But there's also a risk to that, a risk of reducing civil control, democratic management, democratic oversight of security sector. So for us at Folke Bernadotte Academy, well, first of all, we have been supporting, we have had projects in supporting Eastern Ukraine for about 10 years in Donbas region, working on supporting rule of law in public administration. And we just received a new direction from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to prepare new increased support to Ukraine. And we're currently elaborating what that could look like in the current situation during conflict. And then hopefully looking a bit forward to post-conflict. So during conflict, we see an increased militarization, evident also by the role of women being reduced. Recent report from UN Women stating that the role of women in Ukraine in formal decision-making positions have been reduced since February. Now, women obviously play a great role in Ukraine in both military and civilian roles, as well as humanitarian action right now. But we see a decrease in formal decision-making roles. So I think during the time conflict persists, it's still important to look at the democratic system, looking at human security and people's security needs, not only being persuaded by a more state-centered approach, but retaining the focus on human security, people-centered approach. But looking forward to hopefully the day the conflict has ended and we are ready and prepared and ready to spring into action to rebuild, we need to really strengthen, have the priority of people security needs and strengthening, rebuilding democratic governance, especially of the security sector, to have a continued and stronger Ukraine after conflict. So I think it's not only it's important to look at the regional human rights mechanisms, but also how to implement the norms, not only in the domestic systems, but through the international community, the role of EU and OSCE through its peace operations, the CSDP missions and the OSCE missions in Ukraine, actually turning principles into practice. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you very much for joining us and giving us this first brief comments and remarks. There's also been a lot of comments within the chat. We have had, well, the question that was posed on Russia not from the 27 2nd of September, the citizens of Russia not having the possibility to access the European court system, and we've been having answers and comments from different perspectives, so please read in the chat. We've also had another comment here regarding a decision made yesterday on the Foreign Agents Act in the court ruling for 60 NGOs, well, including Memorial, and the violation of Article 11 and 34. So perhaps I could ask somebody that is monitoring the chat that the comments that are posed and that we can see as panelists, you can also pose them openly if it's possible, so everybody can take part of those. I would now like to invite another person to give us a brief comments and some thoughts on what we've heard today. And then we will have a short recess. And I would like to invite the Nordic Director of Human Rights Watch, Måns Molander, that I know has a lot of thoughts on this subject. So welcome, Måns. Happy to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Hannah. And thank you for inviting me. Thanks for a very interesting presentation. And thank you very much for this report, which I think is a huge task to assess the role of these institutions when it comes to human rights and peace and security. I think it has been a very interesting discussion. Of course, I share the view that these institutions have a huge role to play when it comes to exercising the strong power, the influence in the European neighborhood area by strengthening institutions, by strengthening the rule of law, and in that way to strengthen the resilience and the defense against human rights abuses and anti-democratic tendencies. That is absolutely true. Now, looking at the report itself, I think it is a great report. It's a good mapping of the mandates and the articles, conventions of these institutions. And if there's anything I would like to see more, like if you take the next step of developing this report, it would be maybe looking at the concrete output of these institutions and the consequences to see, for example, what is the preventive capacity of the policies and the decisions of these three institutions. For example, the court rulings in situations like in Russia or in Turkey. Because, of course, when we talk about conflict situations, these institutions have all very important roles to play in conflict situations. As has been mentioned, the European Court of Justice has very important rulings on Russia and the wars in Chechnya that has provided both individual measures, so to say compensation for the victims, but also is recommending general measures in order to strengthen the structures to avoid similar abuses in the future. But also, of course, OSCE has played a huge role in mediating conflicts. The monitoring mission they had in Ukraine has definitely contributed. And I want to come to that, the importance of independent monitoring. So I think that would be also interesting to learn more about if there's any assessment of the concrete output of these institutions. And I also think that one aspect is the external action of these institutions, where the EU has of course, by far the strongest capacity to act externally. But I think that to use that external diplomatic leverage strategically is very important. That we see such a very concrete example today when there are discussions around increasing human rights monitoring in Russia and the domestic repression in Russia. It's important, more important than ever, that the EU comes together and that they unify behind a strong demand for stronger monitoring. For example, a special rapporteur in the UN on human rights violations in Russia. But I also think it's important to remember that when we talk about human rights and armed conflict, it's not only about preventing armed conflict, but also to ensure that the parties to conflict respect the rules of war, the international humanitarian law and human rights. And we do, as an organization, strongly believe in the power of independent monitoring. That's a little bit of our DNA, to be there to shed the spotlight of the world on abuses in order to ensure accountability, because the monitoring must be connected with some form of robust accountability. We've been talking about political accountability or legal or court accountability, but the perspective of accountability is key for not only preventing atrocities from happening, but also to ensure a stable ground for peace building post-conflicts. That someone will be held responsible for the abuses is so important for the healing process, for the individual, but for the family, and also for the wider community post-conflict. So accountability is often forgotten in peace negotiations and when everyone wants to look forward. But we believe that that is key to make sure that there's a stable ground, and that's a very good conflict prevention measures to ensure accountability. And it's too early to say about Russia if the monitoring and reporting have raised the bar, because that's something that we definitely see globally, that having independent monitoring lowers the number of civilian casualties. The Norwegian Refugee Council did a very interesting study of Yemen. So this is outside Europe, of course, but it demonstrated that the 4-month when there was an independent monitoring of war crimes of the warring parties in Yemen, and the 4-month after such monitoring was dismantled, there was a double of civilian casualties. So independent monitoring combined with robust accountability really is a question of life and death. And that is something that I think could be also a bit reinforced as the discussions go forward from this point. I don't want to be too long. I know we've already exhausted our deadline for this seminar. I just want to say one comment on the new technology, that I fully agree with all the comments on challenges posed by mass surveillance, data harvesting. This is one of the most problematic challenges in our modern society. It also threatens really the structure of democracies. But one aspect I think we shouldn't forget, and that should be the focus of these 3 institutions, is also the development of fully autonomous weapons based on artificial intelligence, which we know have very large problems with bias in algorithm and do not have the capacity to distinguish civilian from military targets, for example. And to make sure that these 3 institutions really take a strong stance in order to ban these weapons before they reach our societies in full scale should be a priority going forward. But thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, and thanks for a great report and a good seminar. Thanks.
Thank you for joining us so much, Måns. Now we will have a very short recess, just so if somebody needs to get some water or something. We'll be back in, 7 minutes at 11:10. So I invite you all back at 11:10, and we'll be meeting many more guests. Thank you so much. So now the time is 11:10, and I would like to welcome you all back to this webinar that is arranged today by the Swedish Foundation for Human Rights and the launch today of the new report on the role of regional human rights institutions and the quest for peace in Europe, with a comment on the invasion of Ukraine. This report being a small step and with the ambition of closing the gap between human rights, peace and security agenda. And before our short recess, we've had the opportunity to listen to Andrea Huber from the OSCE, to listen to Anna Rogalska, who is a Swedish human rights lawyer, giving us some brief examples of different cases and what we can see at the European Court of Human Rights. We've also been listening to Linda Borgenhed from the Folke Bernadotte Academy, and to Måns Melander, who is the Nordic Director of Human Rights Watch. My name is Hanna Gerdes. I'm a Swedish human rights lawyer, and today I've been given the task to moderate and facilitate this seminar. And I would like to now introduce Olena Sapozhnikova. Olena is a Ukrainian human rights lawyer working at the Ukrainian Helsinki Human Rights Union. And we are so glad to have you with us here today to give us an eyewitness view on the current situation in Ukraine. And I know that directly after being with us today, you're actually heading off to speak at the Ukrainian parliament. So I'm really, really happy that you had the chance to join us today. And I hand over to you. Thank you for joining.
A good day. Yes, today in Ukraine we'll be meeting in Ukrainian Parliament about the situation of Ukrainians internal in Ukraine and abroad. So I will go after my speech. First, thank you for the opportunity to take part in this event. Let me briefly describe myself in the light of the topic under discussion. I am from a beautiful and strong Kiev, the city hero in the capital Ukraine. It is now forced to defend itself and its might against the indecisive armed attacks of Russian Federation. For 8 years, I had hoped that everything would be settled in the east of Ukraine and in the Crimea. For 8 years, I did not understand why the world does not see what war is and does not take decisive steps to stop it. One day, on February 24th, my life from a metropolitan lawyer has turned as a woman with 3 small children seeking temporary protection abroad. Now I am in Warsaw, Poland, with my 3 little children. My husband is in Ukraine. When rocks fly from the sky, you can't stop them with your hands, and they wouldn't protect children with legal speeches under those conditions. So I was forced to travel abroad, and my husband stayed there like millions of men and women also. My young children do not understand where their father is and why they were forced to live without anything in an unknown direction and unknowingly. Moreover, I don't know what to say to them. At first, I explained to the children that the road near our house in Kiev was broken and repaired, and many other houses nearby, that it was dangerous for children to be there and to move there, but everything will be fixed quickly, for example, in summer. But now we have summer, and I can't come back Ukraine. So I understand that for many months we will not be sure that there will be a peaceful sky over Kiev and the rocket will not fall on the city at any moment. So little by little, I began to explain to them. They have been hearing this for a long time from other children who attend kindergarten and school with them here in Poland, Warsaw, that there is a war in the whole Ukraine. And Russia is our enemy who wants to destroy us, and we defend ourselves. However, I still do not know how to tell them that many people from Russia are killing thousands of people and still plan to do so in the future, despite the fact that the whole world is mentally with us. People are dying every day in Ukraine, in this second. Every day in Ukraine die 100 people. It's danger. It's terrible for me, and I think for every people who know about it. The only thing I know is that Ukraine will win, because we are defending our homeland from the invader in the face of the Russian Federation. We can defend our land, and we will do it. But when rockets fly from the sky, it's not like a battle, but cannon distractions, which in the Russian propaganda machine calls liberation and wants the whole world to believe in this lie. The more time I have the opportunity to turn to the world, the more times I will ask the civilized world to help close the sky over Ukraine, help save millions of lives and stop the evil that may come to neighboring lands. Sorry, maybe it's emotional part of my speech, but it's my life, it's part of my life. And I thank you, thank the Swedish Foundation for Human Rights for taking the time to break up the thought result outlined in the draft of the report, the role of regional human rights institutions and the gaps for peace in Europe, with a comment on the invasion of Ukraine. Thank you very much for this work. In my opinion, the draft report successfully reveals all European institutions that have an impact on change in world politics and accordingly on the cause of the war now in Ukraine in particular. I would like to know that it could be added to the report that the European Court of Human Rights has suspended the proceedings against Ukraine since 24th February, pending a separate ruling to the contrary. I would also like to point out that the report could focus more on the situation in military support of Ukraine, because Ukraine has only just begun to receive a significant amount of military equipment, but is still now enough to win the war quickly. And the long war will bring even more loss of people, which is terrible. The adoption of international documents and the holding of international meetings will not be able to stop Russian military equipment, which travels to Ukraine every day and kills thousands of people. We need faster and more decisive actions on the part of Europe, because God forbid Ukrainian falls, Russia will go further, and Poland will be next, and the Russia will go even further. It will not stop at European principles and prohibitions not to fight. Russia will just fight for now. A literal understanding of the war will not stop it, not diplomatically. A restrained and slow European position on the war in Ukraine can lead to people being writing and start sentiments are already present in Ukraine. In European values and codes will eventually ask them if they want to move towards Europe. You can get a negative answer. The European principles concluded after the Second World War are obsolete today and require significant changes, which can be made today during the war in Ukraine, optimizing all bureaucratic procedures in Europe and making it more mobile and effective in the face of new challenges. In addition, I want to draw your attention to other important issues facing Ukrainians today. Russia's numerous attacks on hospitals and schools in Ukraine are war crimes. Second, the military of the Russian Federation is conducting brutal persecution of local government officials, journalists, religious leaders, volunteers, and civil society activists on the territories of Ukraine temporarily occupied by the Russian Federation, following its full-scale invasion in February 2022. As such, Russian Federation continues using Crimea as a military base in its full-scale offensive on mainland Ukraine. Therefore, the Russian Federation is forcibly forcing Ukrainians to fight in Ukraine against Crimea, handing them summonses and threatening repressions if they refuse. In addition, political persecution continues against those who speak out against the all-out Russian aggression against Ukraine, or so much as claim that the war is a war. The first, we have problems in the situation with internally displaced person and externally displaced person, humanitarian corridors, prisoners of war, due process of war crimes, in particular respect for all the crimes of their persecution, including effective legal protection, the persecution of the population in the occupied territories, compliance with legal procedures regarding the activities of the Ukrainian ombudsman, and so on. Ukrainians needs the help of the civilized world in these and other questions. We are open to discussion. Please ask questions and we will work together. It's our life, so we will help if you need. I would like to take this opportunity to once again thank foreign specialists for their assistance to Ukrainians in various fields. At the same time, I would like to draw attention to the fact that Ukrainians have been living in the war since 2014 and have not only theoretical but also practical knowledge, in particular regarding the recording and qualification of war crimes in Ukraine. Therefore, we ask you to take into account the conclusions of Ukrainian specialists and to involve them in cooperation with compliant reports on Ukraine and planning activities aimed at helping Ukraine. I would also like to know that special attention needs to be paid to working with victims of war crimes against civilians, in particular sexual crimes and crimes against children. Victims should be treated with respect, providing them with security, both physical and psychological. First of all, the right not to tell about the crime committed against them in case of severe trauma of these memories should be respected. Thank you very much for the opportunity to take part in this meeting, and specialist of Ukrainian Helsinki Human Rights Union wants to help you if you need it. So involve us and we will try to do all that we can. Slava Ukraini.
Yeah, thank you, Olena. I am very happy that you shared this very, personal note with us as well. Also reminding us all that, I mean, I know you're a human rights lawyer. I've seen your CV. I know everything you've been working on for many, many years. I'm very impressed, but also showing us that after all, first of all, we're human beings, and you're a mother with 3 children right now sitting in Poland because of the war. So I'm really happy you are here with us today. Thank you so much for that. I want to ask you something, because you also gave us some very, clear views on things that you are very clear are lacking right now in the response from Europe, and also some things you would like to see. And I have one first question to you, and it's like there's so many different system, right, in the European regional system, we're trying to work and doing their different things, but do you think they right now are like able to together help Ukraine, or is it like rather a bureaucratic burden slowing everything, that there's so many different actors into this? Like, what's your view on that?
Yes, I think that it's very slowly, and maybe when it's war near your countries, you can change quickly your bureaucratic rules, and it's not ordinary situation. It's extraordinary situation. And maybe we will now near the Third World War. So we have to think about it. We can now do the things that some people didn't do many years ago, and the Second World War we had. So maybe we have now to be quickly and to do not ordinary thing for European, because I see in Poland, for example, when you ask something, people say you wait, check, wait 1 day, 2 day. I think that I have to wait 1 day or 2 days. No, wait 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. Oh, I say, oh my God, why so long? I asked you, and I thought that you answered me in 1 day or 2 days. No, it in Ukraine we have very quickly life now. Everything is changed very quickly. We live in the war, and we understand that if we will not win, the Russian Federation will kill everybody and destruct everything in Ukraine, because it's not only the simple war for resources, it's a war like Hitler against people. It's Putin like a Hitler, I can say, because they don't like everything that's Ukrainian, because when they couldn't go to Kiev, they destroyed everything near the Kiev. It was terrible. So it's not a simple war. It's a genocide of Ukrainian people, and maybe it's not only Ukrainian, maybe European people, because we decided to go to Europe. And for our decision to go for Europe, we have now the war. So maybe Europe has to help us because we decided to go to Europe, and now Europe say, oh, wait, please, 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. No, it's very quickly, everything is changing. So please, close the sky over Ukraine, the first, and then please be quickly and change your rules more quickly, and help us to live and to be the independent state as we are in our minds. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Olena. When people say czekaj, the answer is nie mam czasu czekać. I don't have the time to, Polish, I'm sorry, it means I don't have time to wait. I speak Polish as well. So I would like to, there is some questions that people are posing to you. So I would like to just ask you, well, very clear questions. Are the European institutions able to do anything? What is your answer on that? What would you like, if you would like to mention one thing that you really think that European institutions should be able to do at this point that is not done? You said close the skies. I mean, that's one of the things you've been mentioning. Is there anything else? I mean, we've been talking about different institutions here, but still.
I think that maybe for people, for women with children, for example, who will go away from Ukraine, maybe European countries have to change their minds that we are not refugees. We have a war in Ukraine. We live here for our monies, the most of us. We work in Ukraine now, and we don't ask to give only us money and that we will feel that we are like small babies and European maybe something give us. Not. We fight for Europe. Our husbands fight for Europe. So we now in Europe, not to travel, not to take many things to eat. We live here because we are afraid of rockets that are in the sky. And that's all. We will come back. I can come back tomorrow, today, in 5 minutes, if you will say me that war is far away. So please change the mind about Ukrainians that are in Europe now and change your norms to us. Please give us more help because it's impossible to live on 300 zlotys in Poland. It's impossible to live with children in 400 euro in Germany. It's impossible to live on this money. Don't laugh at Ukrainians, please. We live for money from our husbands from Ukraine. We live for money that we collected many years in Ukraine. Thank you for help some persons, but change the politics of Europe and give us many fire to our men, to Ukraine. And maybe you have to think that it's war not only in Ukraine, it's war for Europe. So war, please fight with us, please.
Thank you, Olena, so much for being very clear on that point. I know you have to go now because you're heading off to Parliament. Really, thank you that you took your time and you joined us today. So thank you
very much.
Us. And for the people who want to also read about the words that Olena now spoke, her speech will also be sent out to all participants following us today. I would now like to hand over to Karolina Vendil-Palin. Karolina is the Deputy Research Director and the head of the Russian project at the Swedish Defense Research Agency, FOI. She has authored a number of publications on Russia, domestic security and military policies. And today she will give us some of her thoughts on human rights, peace and security in the context of the Russian current invasion and attack on Ukraine. So I'm very happy because I read yesterday in DN some of your thoughts, Karolina, and I know you are one of our leading experts on this issue. So we're very happy that you're joining us today. I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. I should note that I'm no longer heading the Russia project. I'm a regular researcher at the FOI by now. First of all, I find it very difficult to follow Olena. I think anything that I can say now is basically uninteresting. I think her appeal and her description of what is going on should sharpen our minds. And I made the intentional decision to talk about the war in Ukraine, or following Olena, I would say the war in Europe. It's a war in Europe that we're seeing. So I'll talk about Russia's war in Ukraine. It's important to call it a war because Russia still refuses to call it a war. And the threat that it poses to Russia's political system, not to the Russian population or individual Russians, but human rights, they constitute a threat to Russia's political system and to the kind of political system that it has become. I will share a presentation. Let's see. And I will talk about three important aspects of Russia's war, but also of wars in general. First of all, let me make the point that when I talk about Russia's responsibility for this war, let's see. My point is very much that it is Russia's war. I often get the question, is it Putin's war or is it Russia's war? And the painful answer is that this is Russia's war as long as Putin is Russia's president. Having said that, I want to echo comments that I've seen in the chat. It's not every individual in Russia who's responsible. And the opposition in Russia right now, they are struggling. They're struggling more than before. But I'll make three main points about wars in general. The first point is that wars are always unpredictable. The second one is that war changes the states that are involved and also the states standing nearby. And thirdly, war is never a goal in and of itself. We spend a lot of time following on the maps exactly where battles are going on. But there's always a political goal behind a war, and the war is a tool. So, my first point. Wars are never predictable. They're always dependent on the situation and what kind of armed forces are involved in the war. But they're also a brutal examiner, to quote a colleague of mine, Johan Norberg. They test whether you have the armed forces that you believed you had, whether you've done your homework when it comes to intelligence and so on. And I've chosen this picture because it illustrates the kind of political system that has become established in Russia. This is Russia's Security Council, the bizarre meeting in the Russian Security Council on the 21st of February this year. It illustrates that this is a political system where you have no free media, of course, no respect for human rights, no free elections. You don't have division of power anymore in Russia, even though the first chapter of the constitution says that that should be the case. There's, of course, no rule of law, but perhaps also, very importantly, there's no scrutiny of the executive branch. And the executive branch has very much become the president. Now, this might be convenient for the president at the time, but it comes at a price. It's absolutely obvious that Russia didn't do its homework before it launched the invasion, the renewed invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February. This is a lonely leader who doesn't like dissent. He probably likes a specific form of information or intelligence reports, and the system around him provides him with what he wants to read. Russia fatally underestimated Ukraine. It overestimated its own armed forces, and it underestimated the response from the West. I would argue that perhaps even we underestimated the response that we were able to unify around. And this leads me to my second point. War changes countries. And Olena already mentioned this. Ukraine has been in war for 8 years already with Russia, and Ukraine has changed. Russia has not registered this. So Ukraine is a different country from the one it was 8 years ago, and Russia is a different country. And last summer, Russia renewed its national security strategy. It braced itself for a long-term conflict with the West, but there was also an enormous amount of focus on domestic and societal security. The fear of so-called color revolutions, which Lev Gutkov from the Levada Center says rightly that we should call democratic revolutions. Ever since 2014 and even before that, repression has increased in Russia. And this national security strategy very much talks about Western values such as human rights, rule of law, as a threat to Russia, as a threat to Russian values, patriotism, Russian spiritual and moral values. This is how they see it. And just to illustrate with opinion polls, even though it's very difficult to interpret opinion polls, there is support for this war in Russia, even though you're not allowed to call it a war. And Andrea Huber, she quoted Einstein about the danger of looking away. And I would argue that many Russians, they chose to look the other way. Another thing that is obvious is that support for Putin has increased after 24th of February. This is a country that's rallying around its leader, and this in turn makes it much easier for the Russian political leadership to point to the dangers of traitors, external enemies, internal enemies, as many have talked about. Russia's external aggression is coupled with an inner repression, and these two tendencies, they reinforce each other. It's not one that leads to another. They are mutually reinforcing, and this has been the case for a long time. So my final point, war is never the goal. This is classical Clausewitz. What does Russia want in Ukraine? Or what does Putin want in Ukraine? Sometimes now we see suggestions that perhaps we could face, or we could provide a face-saving solution, some kind of Minsk III, where Russia is allowed to take Donbass, or some kind of off-ramp. But I would argue that this is not a war for territory. Putin does not care about Donbass. This war had two goals, and Putin very much outlines this in an article that he published just after the national security strategy last summer. He basically says that Ukraine is governed by vassals of the West. It's not a real state. And Ukraine has become a platform for an anti-Russia project that's engineered from the West. So in my analysis, and in many people's analysis, what Russia is doing, it's actually fighting the West in Ukraine. And I think very much many of the points that Olena made makes this clear. Just like Andrea Huber, I would like to end with a quote, because just after the invasion on 24th of February, Vladimir Sorokin, one of Russia's best authors, contemporary authors, he wrote an article in The Guardian. And basically what he says is what I tried to describe, but of course an author does it so much better. The end goal isn't Ukraine, it's Western civilization, including human rights, rule of law. And this is something that is completely alien to Putin's mind, and he sees it as a threat. And that is why this is a European war, not just a war in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolina. This is not just a war on Ukraine, it's a war on Europe. Perhaps that would be, I'm suggesting to the Swedish Foundation now with the Ukraine as an example, perhaps we could change the title to see as a current situation and the fight on Europe, perhaps would be a good title after listening to both Carolina and Olena. Thank you so much for sharing this. I want to ask you one thing though, because of this and what you're saying. I mean, Russia was recently suspended from the Council of Europe. And so, of course, this poses a very important question. I mean, is this the right way to go about it? Because we've seen different approaches, right? We have the Council of Europe, we have the OSCE. And I mean, does this really have an effect on human rights, peace and security? Or is it more, you know, a symbolic gesture, but the result, in fact, will be even greater repression and this view of Putin becoming even stronger? You understand my question? Because what is the right way to go about it? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, I think the suspension of or the exclusion of Russia from the European Council, it's more of a symptom of something that has gone very wrong quite a long time ago. Having said that, I mean, the European Court of Human Rights, Russia has paid its fines and its indemnities. What it has not done, as I understand, I'm not a human rights lawyer, is do the changes to legislation, for example, that the European Court has demanded. I think both Fredrik and Frida and also Måns Molander, they talked about the fact that we notice human rights in organizations like the European Council. It's a way of putting it's an early warning mechanism. And I mean, having worked with arms control issues within the OSCE, it's sort of the same thing. It's the canary in the tunnel. When someone doesn't comply, when they don't answer, well, that's a warning sign that we should take seriously. But I think also Måns mentioned that it's important because it puts the spotlight on individuals. And so, I mean, one of the things that I think is important now is let's not forget Navalny because of the war in Europe. Let's not forget all of the people who are in grave danger inside Russia, and having a name and following individual fates, I think, is important. And as I said, I mean, the constitutional changes that Putin engineered in 2020, they basically said also that Russia felt free not to abide by the decisions of, for example, the European Court of Human Rights. So, I mean, the problem was already there. And I think there's a point where you can no longer adapt to individual members' demands, because then the whole sense and mission of the institution, the basic values, they become undermined. And I think we reached that point.
Can I ask you one more question as well? What do you think, what are the biggest challenges from an accountability point of view now? I mean, in the aftermath, once there is aftermath, if we can see it in that way, of this war, I mean, the challenges, but also what would be possible? What do you think? What are we looking at?
Well, I mean, that very much depends on what we mean with after the war. If we end up, at least temporarily, in some kind of Minsk-free solution, I think that would only be temporarily. I think many people find it desirable because we want to go back to something normal. I don't think there is anything normal to go back to. What has happened in places like Bucha, I mean, you can't go back, you can't rewind history. But I mean, if we end up in a Minsk-free solution or in just a protracted war and conflict, perhaps less intense than it is right now, then of course there can't be an issue about accountability. I think we will have parallel justice systems where Russia is completely without rule of law, of course, but they will have their own court cases against Ukrainian soldiers and so on. But I mean, in a longer term, I think this war will change Russia, and we don't know exactly how it will end. I hear more and more Russian commentators talking openly about perhaps Russia will not exist in the form that it exists right now in 10 to 15 years from now. And I think one of the things that certainly strikes me is that after 1991, Russia never really dealt with its own history, which is very complicated and painful for many. And I think in the next phase, they would have to deal with their own history. They need to perform some kind of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, and because what you see now in Russia very much in the debate and in the support for the war in Ukraine are also theories of having been stabbed in the back in 1991. And what many refer to as the Versailles syndrome, that the Russian Empire basically was lost because of treason. And I think it will be very difficult to build a new Russia on those on that basis.
Yeah. I want to thank you so much, Carolina, for joining us, and thank you so much for your reflections. It's been really interesting and valuable for us listening. And I would like to now to thank you and also welcome Ian Anthony. He is the director of the European Security Program at CIPRI. And CIPRI, for those who perhaps hasn't heard about it, is an independent international institution dedicated to research into conflict, arm control and disarmament. So I hand over to you, Ian. Thank you so much for joining us and giving us some brief comments on what we've heard. Thank you.
No, I hope you can hear me, and thank you for the opportunity to join what's been an extremely interesting and useful event. So much to say. I mean, first of all, perhaps just to say that the comprehensive security framework that was established in the early 1990s recognized the integrated nature of politico-military issues with human rights, democracy, rule of law. And even if a lot of attention now is paid to the hard security elements for obvious reasons, I think the first part of this meeting was a very, very useful reminder that we have to keep monitoring, analyzing, adapting and modernizing the whole framework. So I think the points made by Andrea are very well taken on that. But just some sort of fairly spontaneous responses. One of the questions we have to face is how to deal with the reality that Russia has defected from that system created in the 1990s. And the instruments to influence Russia are now much weaker. So the first question that arises out of that is whether there should or is any longer an ambition to try even and transform Russia, or whether what we're really talking about is letting Russia be Russia and the rest of us protect ourselves against the consequences of that, while moving forward without Russia at the table to continue to develop the European framework. And that seems to me to be the direction of travel. Second point, really, as an immediate response to what Kara just said about Russia, I think it's a growing understanding that progress is needed now on a lot of questions, because it's just not possible to know when post-war conditions will exist. The remark about the early 1990s, it's a kind of reminder that in the Russian discourse, Ukraine has a special place, I think. If you think about what people like Alexander Solzhenitsyn were writing in the early 1990s, even though he hated communism and was a strong opponent of the Soviet Union, he would completely agree with Mr. Putin's perspective that Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine should be united as one political entity. He would fully subscribe to that. So it's not only a Putin issue, it's a Russia issue, and this is a protracted, whatever happens in terms of a short-term ceasefire in Ukraine, This is a protracted contest with Russia, which isn't going to end in months. And if Mr. Putin disappeared tomorrow, elements of this would still be a strong feature of the discussion. Perhaps just turning to some of the issues that were raised by Olena, and of course we can only have sympathy and compassion for the situation she finds herself in. What we're facing there is essentially trying to find an ethical response to an unethical opponent. And it's a reminder rather than a learning exercise, because I think we knew this, but it's a reminder that for Russia, targeting civilians is part of their way of war. It's not collateral damage. It's for strategic effect, to sap the will of the opponent and to conduct an economic warfare that reduces the ability to resist. And we can't have a symmetrical approach. It will never be acceptable for Western countries or NATO to either extract reprisals or target civilians. So we have to think through what are the ethical elements of responding to an unethical opponent. There is a military dimension to that, but that's probably for another meeting. I would just say, in response to one of the previous comments, a central element of Western military modernization is going to be exploiting technology. And if you set your goal as a ban on, for example, autonomous weapons or use of AI, you're setting yourself up for failure, because that is going to be a central component of Western military modernization. So that's a control issue where ethical questions are highly relevant, but a ban is not a productive approach. There are other things, though, where we have to have serious conversations. The role of civil defense is at the moment under-analyzed, building on resilience in peacetime, but thinking about what that means in wartime, where we can't use some of the instruments that Russia uses, mass internment, intrusive surveillance. Again, for ethical reasons, these tools will probably not be available. Also bleeding over into strategic communications, which so far have been used essentially to describe what the country is doing or not doing, but that's transforming into influence operations where respect for the truth and accurate reporting may become subordinate to creating effects. And that's an area we need to look at closely from an ethical perspective. And finally, on the point of accountability, I think we're already seeing the direction of travel there. The recent initiatives, for example, by the European Union and the United States are clearly intended to support the Ukrainian Prosecutor General and to make sure that whatever Ukraine does in terms of accountability follows standards that don't mirror the Russian standards we've been hearing about, whether it's related to prosecution of war crimes or treatment of prisoners of war, making sure that we can collect, analyze, and preserve evidence, absolutely, but within a legal framework that meets Western standards.
Thank
Those
you.
are some spontaneous reactions to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Ian, for your comments and for joining us today and reflecting. And I think one thing that's also been very valuable for this, this webinar is all of the different speakers and guests that we've had, you actually meeting, because you're working with these issues from so many different perspectives. And so it's really valuable for us and for the further work, of course, also for the foundation to hear your different perspectives on how we can use this system. So thank you for joining us for this webinar. I know if you have any more questions, you can also post them in the chat and you will be getting written answers to them. Please also write what is your greatest takes from today. We would want to conclude just a couple of minutes, because at 12 o'clock we're all heading out for lunch, to hear a little bit what's going to happen now. So I would like to invite just briefly Frederick and Frida back. Hi, welcome back. I just want to ask you, what will happen now with this report? I mean, this webinar has been so interesting. Thank you so much for letting me join this and facilitate it. And I'm really interested in what's going to happen now. I mean, when you look at the nexus of human rights, peace, and security, and the launch of the report today, what is the next step for you?
Well, the nexus between human rights and peace and security is a central part of our work. since its components include the redress for grave human rights violation, the rule of law, and transitional justice. And we have many years of interaction with the regional systems for human rights in Africa and the Americas. And in line with this mandate, we have conducted several studies, and we will continue to explore the importance of human rights system in the nexus between human rights, peace, and security. And as for this particular report on the human rights system in Europe, we will publish it on our webpage following this seminar and also print it later on. As Frederick mentioned, this report is the third in a series. The first report, Silencing the Guns in Africa, was launched in 2020. And the second report on the Americas was published early 2022. And in the course of this year, we will examine the existing institutions within the region of the Asia Pacific and then the Middle East. And in future, we aim at undertaking a comparative study of all the regional human rights systems that we have been studying, including facilitate an exchange between the regions. And lastly, we also strive at examining the UN as the global human rights system.
Mm-hmm. Will you change the title? Will it be a brief example of the war on Europe then instead of on Ukraine?
I think it was a very good takeaway from this seminar, yes.
You might think about it anyway.
We will discuss it, yeah.
So Frederick, also just a very quick last question to you. If you would say, what is the greatest takes, for you after listening to this today, because you've been working for a long time, I know, on this report, and now you've been listening to all these experts. So what are your biggest takes from today?
Well, I will keep it short. I think one of the takeaways is the necessity of early warning, which was raised by several panelists, and as the canary in the tunnel, as put by Carolina, and we did elaborate a bit more on that in our studies on Africa and the Americas, and specifically how the knowledge on the early warning must reach the decision-making bodies of the intergovernmental organizations at, of course, finally also that these have to act on these facts. Regarding Ukraine, well, as been put before, we knew already from 2014 the invasion of Crimea and also the events in the Donbas region, and we also saw the events in Georgia. So there were quite clear early warning signals that were also readily available. But well, I think the discussions confirmed this, and I also confirmed the necessity to connect different actors and facilitate dialogue between them and between the different professions and roles to break the silos and apply an intersectional approach, and also connect the political responsibilities and legal responsibilities. And for the different bodies of law, this field also connects the international humanitarian law with human rights law and international criminal law, which also at times tends to be separate communities. And then, of course, finally, the intervention of Olena also, it's impactful, and I think it's very valuable in a seminar like this. It basically, it confirms this and the need for accountability mechanisms, but it also puts the difficult question as how to react when a state is not listening and complying, and indirectly also puts the question of applying maybe the responsibility to protect. But I will not go further into that, as that will probably be another seminar.
Now it's 12 o'clock, so we need to head for lunch. But just one last sentence. Where can we find the report, and when we'll be able to find it? Do you already find it on your webpage now, or when can we find it?
We can find it on our webpage as soon as this seminar is done.
Perfect. So in 10 minutes, you can look into www.humanrights.se. So with this, we would like to say thank you all for joining us today. This webinar has also been recorded, so you will be able to look at it afterwards if you missed some parts. And thank you so much for the Swedish Foundation for arranging this. It's been a really interesting conversation today. And thank you for letting me join.